All right, Jared Yates Sexton joins us here on the Can We Please Talk podcast. He's a fantastic writer. His new book is out now. You can go get it wherever books are sold. It's called The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. It's over his right shoulder for those of you watching on YouTube. He's also the host of the Muckrake podcast, available wherever you get your podcast. Jared, Mike Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Hey, thank you. I'm a big fan. This is a real treat for me, so thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. That soundbite will now be clipped and lived in the annals of people pumping us up even further. Jared, we're going to get into a bunch of stuff here because we were talking off air about a bunch of different things and themes from the book that are playing out in my life, Nick's life, and maybe even people that are listening to this show. But first, for our audience, I mentioned the book at the top here. It's out now wherever books are sold. Tell us a little bit about an overview of the book and what made you want to write it.
Yeah, so The Midnight Kingdom was sort of an effort by me to sort of understand how we arrived at this moment, this modern moment of crisis. And I've come to believe over the past 6 years, as I've been doing journalism, as I've been doing historical research, as I've been doing political, social, psychological research, I've come to believe that we are at a crossroads. That the system that we've been living under is starting to crumble. It's starting to fail. I think we all feel that to a certain extent, right? That it's not only not fair, but it's also just not functional. Like something is shifting, something is changing. We're looking at the possibility of a different future, but we're not particularly working towards creating it, like, trying to make that better future. And unfortunately, the far right, a really dangerous international authoritarian movement, is taking advantage of what's happening right now in the world. And I needed to understand how the flow of history and how this ideology, how it's worked. And so what I did was I went back to the beginning of modern history, where Christianity merged with Roman power, right? And what I did was I traced how power protected itself, how it moved throughout history, the stories it told, how these sort of crossroads always played out. And I did it to understand more about this moment, but also what is possible. And what I came to was that we're at a moment of great danger, but also really great opportunity. There is a window open right now for us to make a better future. And this book was trying to wrestle with that history, but also wrestle with what is possible.
Jared, as you bring up that, I nerd out about that a lot, about where we in Christianity we go from a pivotal figure in Jesus to now being paired with Roman authority. Everything from the depiction of Jesus being lighter skinned than he likely was, but and it is what it is. That being said, though, at that point of origin, is that really the beginning point where we see power and religion being fused together as an attempt for essentially authority to maintain power through the guise of, well, this is what our religion, this is what our perception of God tells us is right and just?
So if you look at the Roman Empire, the way that it sort of held hegemonic rule over the world, right? Like, and Rome told a story about itself. There's a reason why it was, the dominator of the time. It told a story that Roman civilization, so-called Western civilization, was the pinnacle of civilization, right? And that meant that anybody within it, particularly the wealthy and the powerful within Rome, deserved everything. They deserved all the luxuries. They deserved all the wealth, everything they could have. Anybody outside was a barbarian, right? They needed to be conquered. They needed to be destroyed. They could be subject to any amount of violence or oppression. One of the things that I found, because I didn't really know how that happened. I didn't understand how Christianity and Rome merged. And what I discovered very quickly, and this sort of set the book off in the direction that we're talking about, I realized that Christianity became the gravity of the new Roman Empire because the old ideas were falling apart, right? It was this Roman imperial cult, the idea that their emperors were like chosen by a god or the universe, or they were gods themselves, right? And eventually, over the years, as they were awful, they were like oppressing people and hurting people, eventually that myth started to fall by the wayside. And as Rome started to decline, they needed to find something to replace it, right? And so what I discovered very quickly was that whenever the world has like a status quo, whenever there's like an organizing story. So say, for instance, right now, we've been living in the American century, right? We've been living in the American dominated world in which America is the sole superpower. Well, I think we all know that things are changing, right? That America is in decline to a certain extent. On top of that, the quality of life in America doesn't feel the same. We're working for less money, we're being exploited. You're even watching like our lifespans start to like lower, right? This doesn't seem like what the great power should be, and we are living in the decline of the American superpower. That opens the question, what's the next story that we tell ourselves, right? Like, what's the next organizing mythology? And the problem is that right now, you're watching power, much like it did with the Roman Empire. They're using religion, they're using these mythologies, they're using these narratives to create the new structure. And the problem when you go that route is that you always end up oppressing people. You always end up saying, this group over here is better, this group over here is not. That group deserves to be conquered. That group deserves to be, even wiped out in genocidal violence. And so what I discovered very quickly was, as these status quos start to change and they're interrupted, there's a real possibility that a story that you never could have imagined, such as Christianity, which was oppressed and underwent incredible violence. All of a sudden, it becomes the ruling mythology or the ruling narrative that then protects power and moves it into the next cycle.
Jared, one of the things I appreciated about the book, and I was telling you this off air about, obviously you go back into the history books, like you just mentioned, you go into different time periods, things that have happened here in this country, 9/11. I wanted to ask you, though, because we were talking about this off air, and I wanted to draw the parallels back to the focus group stuff that I was telling you about that we had done earlier back in October before the voting cycle. And a young conservative guy who we featured on the podcast in one of the focus groups, telling us about, his shifting ideology as he started to get older. He started to realize, grew up in a Christian household, and some of the things he's being told, as he starts to get into college and start to make more friends of different ethnic backgrounds, he starts to lean a little bit more moderate. And he says he pinpointed to kind of not so much the Black Lives Matter movement, but hip hop and the plight of African Americans as told through music, but then also the social, sharing of like things that have happened to them with respect to police brutality, other things. What advice would you give to somebody that's listening to this pod? Because you make some parallels into your own life with your grandmother in the book. But what advice would you say to someone listening to the pod that maybe has been through a similar plight like yourself, or that young conservative that we mentioned in the focus group?
Yeah, to go ahead and give a little bit of biographical info on me. I grew up in southern rural Indiana. I'm talking like in the middle of nowhere. I come from an extremely poor family. We're talking about factory workers, laborers, miners, prison guards, like servant class type people. And I got to tell you, I was raised up in some really extreme evangelicalism. Like what we're seeing now with QAnon, what we're seeing now with what people would call Christian nationalism, right? And by the way, for anybody who doesn't know this or doesn't follow this, Christian nationalism is an extremely radicalized version of Christianity. The idea that Republicans, supporters of Donald Trump, these types of people are fighting a literal supernatural war against supernatural evil, right? I was raised in that in the 1980s. I basically every Sunday was told that the literal devil was trying to attack America. And, the devil used everything against you, everything from the movies that you were watching, the music you would listen to, your friends at school who would, peer pressure you into sinning or doing whatever. Those people were being manipulated by the literal Satan, right? The conservative mindset, and I want to point out a couple things. Christianity doesn't have to be like that, right? This isn't a criticism of Christianity. We're talking about weaponized faith here, right? Which includes apocalyptic elements. If too much changes, Satan will win and the world will end, right? That is a literal belief within these groups. There's also the idea that persecution is necessary. There's a positive persecution, which is a larger topic. But one of the things that happens within the conservative mindset is the idea that you as an individual are responsible only for yourself. And the reason for that is because everyone around you at any given moment could screw you over. They want to take what you have. They want to step in front of you. It honestly, the modern conservative mind is paranoid in nature, right? The idea that there are so many conspiracies, and we've noticed this, right? Like I always point out Donald Trump Jr., every time he's on something, he talks about how he doesn't get enough impressions on his Instagram, You know, he doesn't get enough views on his Instagram. There has to be a shadow ban. We're even seeing that now as like on Twitter, you actually have like a right-wing ideologue who is controlling Twitter. They're still talking about shadow bans, right? So the conservative mindset is the idea that everyone's out to get you and you can't trust one another. And a lot of that is powered by the idea of original sin, that we're all born wicked and wretched, and you know, unless we're saved or whatever, we can't be trusted. What I want to point out is this: what I realized over time, and it took a while to heal from that trauma, what I had to realize was that our modern system, and we call it neoliberalism, globalism, whatever we want to get into here, it tells you that you are alone, that you should not trust other people. Like, you know, I've listened to you all and I've formed parasocial relationships with you, so I feel, you know, I can trust you. But at the same time, like, I don't really know you. At any given moment, like, something might happen, you know, there might be someone jumping out of the shadows, or, you know, you might be stealing my bank account number. I don't know. But
Right, right.
like, it keeps us from talking to other people. We've become an atomized society where we don't necessarily trust our families, we don't trust our loved ones, we don't trust our coworkers. And part of that has created a paranoid mindset where you see conspiracies everywhere, because why wouldn't you, right? If you truly think that everybody's out to get you, why wouldn't you believe in conspiracies? That mindset is what has to be pushed against. And what I've noticed, and this is important, is that for all of my family members, all of my friends who have become radicalized, who have fallen down QAnon rabbit holes, the big lie, all of these things, it never happens because they're feeling good, right? They're all having personal crises. They're feeling alone. Something is falling apart, whether it's economically, you know, their jobs, their marriages, whatever. What I have noticed is that when you notice someone being radicalized, particularly through these conspiracy theories, if you reach out to them and talk to them as human beings, they're going to tell you what's going on with them, right? And that starts to push back against that paranoid mindset, that conspiracy mindset. It has to be a larger societal sea change. It's, you know, and you and I can do this. We can talk with people. We can work on this individually. That's something we can do in our lives. We can heal ourselves and help heal other people. But there has to be a push against that mindset that we're all alone and that we're all fighting one another, basically for scraps of the pie at this point.
Jared, in the story you share about your grandmother, and even early, what we saw, I'm forgetting the name of the pastor in the 40s during the Depression. But the idea, thank you. We went from people who seem really down for the cause. Like, I don't doubt whether Father Coughlin believed what he believed. It seems like we've now changed pace to a world where Donald Trump, Mike Lindell, pillow dude, it seems like some of this may potentially be disingenuous. On this show, we talk often that, and Mike gives this example all the time, and I credit him constantly about this idea of being pot committed. Folks who say one thing on television or some other form of media, but behind the scenes, they are vaccinated. They don't believe these things that they say, and there's an element of professional wrestling that's taken place. Have we moved to a place where there's still that fervor for conservatism, but now it's being manipulated by people who see it potentially as a grift?
Oh, absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up professional wrestling too, because this whole thing is a giant work that turns into a shoot. And anybody who knows anything about this subject, like they understand.
My heart's melting
that,
right now.
Yeah.
Wrestling fans. This is awesome.
But it really is, because what happened, and
Our show is brought to you by the good folks at Fresh Roasted Coffee, freshroastedcoffee.com since 2009, making quality coffee at an amazing, affordable price. Hit the link right now in our episode description, and you can get a discount on this amazing coffee for being a listener and watcher of Can We Please Talk.
Listen, Donald Trump is not the disease. He's a symptom of a larger problem. This was going to happen in one way, shape, or form. He just happened to be the perfect sort of messenger of the moment, the person who could take advantage of this. Donald Trump came around and he said, you know what? Both of the parties are corrupt. They haven't been taking care of you. Deindustrialization, global capitalism has screwed you over. And guess what? He was right. That is true. That has happened. This modern era has screwed over, basically everybody except for like a tiny, tiny 1% that has had trillions, and I say that with a T, trillions of dollars redistributed from us to them. right? I mean, that's the difference between having, again, a wealthy Donald Trump in the 1980s who has his own private jet and Elon Musk who has his own personal space program, right? That is a system that doesn't work. And he says both of the parties are corrupt. He's right. They are. They have been bought off by a lot of the same people, particularly, different pockets of them. The problem was he didn't mean it. He didn't care. He was like one of the people who took advantage of all of it. When he got into office, instead of, pursuing any of this, he actually just took orders from people like the Heritage Foundation, who handed him basically a list of here are the ways to like make ourselves wealthier and more powerful. What he has created and what's being taken advantage of is what I refer to as faux populism. It is telling people what they want to hear, right? Because there's an audience for it, and then bilking them for more money and continually turning the dial. And what you were talking about in terms of what you say in front of a camera and what you say behind it, Washington, D.C., particularly, has created an entire culture of professional wrestling in which these people are making unbelievable amounts of money by ratcheting the tension up. And by the way, it's not just politicians. It's also the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Like, these people are profiting off of chaos and instability that is radicalizing people. So what has actually happened is there is a need to talk about these things. There is a need for populism. It just so happens that the need was so obvious that the world's like absolute worst grifter took advantage of it. And now the right wing in an incredible way, gets all of its funding from like a few shadow donor billionaires who want to destroy the federal government and basically get rid of any representative government. And meanwhile, they are going after people on the ground that they are screwing over. And it is this cycle that needs to be broken. But the problem is that nobody particularly wants to talk about the system being broken because the people, the media, the political class, you name it, they're the ones profiting off of it. They're the ones who gain the power and the wealth and the affluence. So as a result, they can't deal with it or they know what they're doing. So it turns into a cycle that just gets worse and worse and worse.
I've always told people, you know, that I haven't made it big yet financially because my opinions are calm, right? They're cool, collected. It's like somebody told us once upon a time, there's no money in the middle. It was a famous producer of a movie called Better Left Unsaid, this political doc that examines the extremes, the polar left, the far left and the far right in different countries. And he said that to me, and I was like, yeah, you're right. We haven't made any money yet. So I know we're right down the middle. But I want to bring this to you because, I was listening to your podcast and you guys in the last episode, the Muckrake podcast available wherever you get your pods. You guys were talking about, what's been playing out in Brazil, right? I have family that lives in Brazil, in Victoria. And, everything with Bolsonaro is very eerily similar to the Trump stuff. But you had a quote in your book that I want to read here and ask a question on because there was a former Obama administration official. He was talking about international terrorism and, the Bush administration and the war on terror, and then how it goes over into the Obama administration. And he makes this analogy about fighting international terrorism is like mowing the lawn, if you remember in the book. I'm sure you do, Jared. And he talks about like you need to cut the grass all the time, right? In relation to if you're going to fight these terrorists, you got to kill one, even though 2 or 3 may sprout up afterwards. You still have to do it, right? Because you got to cut the grass, or else the grass is going to get out of control. But he was talking about international terrorism, and what we're seeing now play out domestically is homegrown terrorism. We've had DHS officials, CIA, FBI officials on this program, ton of them, espionage, related agents, all of them have said the number one issue that we should be focused on is domestic terrorism. This stuff is no longer the international folks trying to kill us here. We got people here trying to kill us. So what do we do about this growing problem with extremism and the folks that are going down this rabbit hole of misinformation, disinformation? Because you talked about it a little bit of this empathy and talking to each other, and you stole my whole thunder about pushing these people to the extremes and not caring about them anymore because they don't live in the right, wrong universe. But now I'm curious, because of all of this rise of domestic terrorism, what we're seeing copycatted in Brazil, it's happening around the world. Italy has a far right prime minister. Like, what do we do about it here in the US?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there because I think this is one of the biggest questions of our time. Because we're literally watching, and history shows us what happens when we have situations like this. This is a powder keg. Something like January 6th or now January 8th in Brazil shows us how easily these upset faux populist movements, and by the way, that's what it is in Brazil as well. It shows how easily they can be radicalized to the point of violence. I tell everybody, January 6th was not just a big group of people that went in and did this. It was three separate groups. You had Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, who were like paramilitaries who wanted a civil war and wanted an authoritarian regime. You had QAnon people who were more than ready to carry out massive cleansing violence. And then you had a bunch of MAGA supporters that some of them showed up in their own private planes, and others were there to burn things down. So what you realize is when you look at something like January 6th, you look at the number of people who were won over to help with the insurrection, right? Who were there to help with the coup attempt. You always have to think about how do you curb sort of the fever a little bit. And I'm always very, very careful when we're talking about law enforcement, right? Because one of the things that happened after September 11th, which I got to tell you, I think is going to go down in history as one of the worst mistakes that a superpower has ever made. Like the way that we handled that, like we literally allowed Al Qaeda, which wasn't a real international terrorist sect, it was a group of people who carried out this massive act. We allowed them to completely divert all of our resources and also engulf ourselves in a paranoia, while meanwhile, terrible tragedy of September 11th, you look at how many people have been killed by right-wing extremists in that time and how many people have been killed by white supremacist paramilitary groups. It's incredible, right? The eye got taken off of the ball. I don't think that the answer is like heightened security. I think we have all of the laws that we need. I think we have all of the technology. We have all the resources that we need for law enforcement and all of these groups. I think it's going to take a sea change in how we look at the problem. And you talk about people who are in Homeland Security, which I personally think Homeland Security shouldn't exist anymore. I think it's been an impediment in all of this. And you take a look at like the FBI. The FBI is lousy with people who are involved in this stuff, right? For everybody who surveils it, there's a member in there. You take a look at law enforcement. They're involved in a lot of these groups. The military is as well. Part of the reason is we're not addressing the problems that radicalize people, the material conditions. We keep calling it things like Joe Biden. Say what you want about Joe Biden. Joe Biden said that they were semi-fascist. I think that was the exact quote that he said. It's sort of dipping your toe into what this is, right? You're not calling the problem out for what it is. You're not talking about how it's un-American to go after voting, to go after election results. The tepidness in calling this what it is and actually using the resources that are there and talking about I'm sorry, we have to talk about white supremacy in this country. We have to talk about the fact that it's been here since the very beginning of this country. It has influenced all of our laws, all of our economics, all of it. We have to have a sea change that says, guess what? We have to redistribute some of that trillions of dollars that have been put towards the top. And I want to point out very quickly, I think that we misunderstand something in American history. Someone like a Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal, right? Because people still sort of think about the New Deal as if it's the consensus that we live within. Franklin D. Roosevelt, they tried to overthrow his government. They tried, like in the business plot, they literally tried a coup against FDR. They went out and they were supporting Charles Lindbergh, who was saying that we should team up with Adolf Hitler. They were giving money to fascists, like this wealth class that is now sort of buying off our democracy. People need to understand that those things were miracle moments of leadership where somebody called the problem out for what it was and also worked over here to sort of, I don't know, pull the temperature down, right? There's a fever right now in the American populace. And the only thing that's going to help with that fever is to do things like invest in things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, to pay for programs that make sure that a bunch of, young men aren't sitting around online watching videos about, ISIS-like attacks on the government. So there are ways to do it. The problem is that there isn't a lot of heart in our current leadership to do it, right? They're not really interested in talking about those things. They're not interested in having a larger societal shift. And I personally think it has to happen.
Jared, we're in the business on this show when we have authors on about making sure they have a space to really tell people why to buy their book, because we only bring people on that we're excited about the books that they have, such as yours. So I will not ask you the question of what's the most surprising thing. I know people got to go get it. I have a copy of it. Mike's got a copy of it. Obviously, you have your own copies. We don't want people to, cheat. But what is, say, the second most surprising thing of your book that people would gain upon reading it?
I would go ahead and put this out there. We talk a lot about this current political moment, and you hear a lot of things, right? A lot of words, unprecedented. And it's not. That is the thing that really surprised me the most in researching this. I traced QAnon conspiracy theories back to ancient Rome. I literally traced them back to the original Christians. QAnon explicit. The idea that Christians were like sacrificing babies to bathe in their blood and gain superpowers. That took place in ancient Rome. If you actually go back to the origins of conservatism, it was based in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The idea that Freemasons and Illuminatis and Jews were trying to overthrow France and America and all this, right? My point is this. The book is trying to argue, and what I'm trying to tell people is that we can learn from how these things have worked, right? And part of the problem that we have right now, and to put a cap on this or a through line on this, I hate to say it as a former educator, our educational system isn't working. We're not teaching people actual history. We're not teaching people civics. We're teaching them weaponized ideology, which, by the way, is happening more and more. I want to say you said you were in Florida. Right? Florida right now is attacking its educational system and turning it into an indoctrination system, the likes of which that I through history, I haven't seen since like the rise of Clemens von Metternich. I mean, it is really wild what's happening in Florida. But the American educational system has not prepared us to, first of all, see when authoritarianism is rising, right? When radicalism is happening, and also what is actually happening in history. We have this sort of sterilized idea of how we've arrived at this point, and it's a weaponized understanding of history. So for me, I think the first step in fighting back and the first step in making a better future is understanding how we got here. Right? It's understanding like what the cycles of history have been like and actually learning from the mistakes and the moments of the past. I think we can learn from the people who made the world better. And I think we can especially learn from the people who made the world worse. And this was my attempt to tell a different story of history so that we could start to arm ourselves and we could say, hey, that's what that is. Come on, let's stop, sugarcoating it. Let's stop pretending it's something else. Like this is authoritarianism and here's how we're going to deal with it.
Jared, I got like 71 more questions. Nick wants to nerd out for 3 more hours as somebody who works in the education system right now with school districts and leaders everywhere. Can't do all of that, folks. Time constraints here in the podcast. Digestible format. We're trying to give you 45 minutes so Nick can rant for another 15 minutes to make it an hour episode. Jared Yates Sexton is a fantastic author. You can check out the Muckrake podcast, available wherever you get your podcast. The Midnight Kingdom, the book over his shoulder, A History of Power, Paranoia, and The Coming Crisis. It's out now wherever books are sold. Go get it. I know, Jared, you're big on promoting local bookstores, so go to your local bookstore and get it. Jared, can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast. Continued success to you, sir. Please stay safe. You're welcome back anytime. You write another book about maybe another subject matter. I love talking to you, man. Continued success to you, sir.
Well, wonderful. We got to have you on the podcast here sometime soon. We'll have to do like a 4-man pod.
Love it. Sounds good.
Thanks, guys.
Nick, quick break because our show is presented by the good folks at Fresh Roasted Coffee. Amazing tasting coffee. Look at this. Let me take a... Oh, man. I always have a cup of coffee before we record, while we're recording. I can't get enough of this. This is the Colombian Supremo. You are a coffee snob, as the people that watch us and listen to us know. What do you love about the good folks over at Fresh Roasted Coffee and what they're brewing up?
Yeah, I mean, well, first, the fact that you get to learn about coffee. When you go on the website, there's a section just called Learn, and I would recommend anyone go click on it. In addition to learning about the different types of brewing coffee, I'm a French press person myself, but I also have a Chemex as well. So I basically just, everything's sort of a coffee maker we've got here, or different kinds of it. But you also can take a test, so you can find out what is the coffee flavor that's right for you. Right. How many places do that? So I go through it. I find that Sumatra's my blend, which I'm ordering, waiting for it to come in. Sampler packs. I love getting variety. So that's how I always start. So I got a pack of 6 that just came recently. Mike, I'm down to my last one. Can't get enough of it.
It's delicious. And right now, for being a Can We Please Talk watcher and listener, You can click on the link below right now. You see that little link that our producer put up right there?
Just right there.
Click on that link, or in our episode details, there'll be a link as well, and get started on some fresh, delicious roasted coffee from the good folks at Fresh Roasted Coffee. All right, our thank yous there to Jared Yates Sexton. Like I mentioned, the book is out now wherever books are sold. The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. That's right. I'm reading my cheat sheet over here, folks. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, Jared's book, though, is over my shoulder, over Nick's shoulder. For those of you watching on YouTube, a really good read. No joke. Go out there, get the book wherever books are sold. We've been promoting so many different authors that have been on the program, but it's the subject matter in this book. Jared really takes you through, and he said it in his own words, the history of like how we got here. But a lot of the times we're not offering solutions as to how to get out of this. You know, like how do we get out of your aunt getting down a misinformation, disinformation rabbit hole? Now she thinks the election is stolen. Like, how do you get out of that? And one of the things that I took away from the interview that I thought was really interesting was the psychological part of this. You talk to somebody and then you get at the root of the problems and how they're using that outlet to channel some of this negativity, whatever's brewing inside of them, whatever they're going through, personal, work, whatever it is. Once you start talking to them and breaking down those layers, you get at the root of why they're going down these rabbit holes. The problem I have, Nicholas, before I let you go, is you know how I feel about that. Because I'm very big on the sky is blue, the sun is yellow. If we're having a conversation, you and I both have to be on the up and up, that those are facts. Not my facts, not your facts. Those are actual facts. If you don't believe in that stuff, my defense mechanism is get out of my face, see you later, and you're completely cut off. And we've had other people who have been on this program. They're like, you can't necessarily do that because that's at your own peril, because now those folks find somebody else to gravitate to that think like that. I've been pushed out. I've been, cast aside. And now we're seeing what we're seeing on January 6th, what we've seen in Brazil. And then somebody come in and just lead that. You are being lied to. You are being fed this, and I can change it and do this and that. What were some of your takeaways on the interview there with Jared?
Yeah, the biggest takeaway is that, and it's actually a very reassuring one, is that these are not unprecedented times. Jared mentions that a couple of times, and you can trace some of these conspiracy theories and some of the origins of the leanings for organizations like QAnon is rooted far back into our past. And that's important to know, because if we know the origin of it, if we understand the nature of the beast and it keeps coming back, then we can be able to figure out what it is that we can do about it. When we talk to folks who are just stunned by what we saw with Trump and with January 6th, and now most recently January 8th in Brazil, and when that feeling of like, what do you do? And these are times I can't, this has never happened before. To be able to point to a book like Jared's and say, you need to read this, because this is a trend, and the origins of that trend are important to understand, because that's the only way we're ever going to combat this. I thought he did an incredible job of just sort of taking us briefly through that cycle, shedding some light on some other interesting details in the book. And like you, I would just highly recommend, especially for anyone like me, that you start to grow a library of books that you were never exposed to, in history class. Books that tell you how we got here. Jared's book really checks the box for both of those for me.
Yeah, no, very well said. And by the way, like we were mentioning before, we're going to be going on his podcast hopefully soon. Check out the Muckrake podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts, because it is pretty good. Him and his co-host Nick go through a lot of similar issues that you and I are talking about on this show, and obviously then we bring on journalists and stuff like that to provide added context. But they were just talking about, what's been playing out in Brazil, which was a recent episode that I heard. So shout out to them for that podcast. Shout out to Jared for the book. Go check out his book wherever books are sold. Like I mentioned, The Midnight Kingdom. It's out now. Speaking of, I don't have a transition. I never do. But if you want to watch the video interview of Jared being on the program, check out our YouTube channel. Type in Can We Please Talk Podcast. Hit the subscribe button. And please follow us. Please follow us across IG, Twitter, TikTok at Can We Please Talk Podcast, on Twitter at Can We Please Talk. Audio podcast platforms, you know them by now. Shout out to the folks at Good Pods and everybody that listens to us over there, but Apple, Spotify, Google, go check us out. Acast is our hosting platform. We can't do it without them. Can't do it without each and every one of you. Each week, that listens to this program and listens to fantastic guests that know what they're talking about, like Jared. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Severi.
We'll see everybody next time. Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.